الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much, Imam Hussain, for inviting me. And thank you all for coming this evening to discuss an issue that is very central to the entire Ummah, and that is the situation today in Palestine. What I'd like to do is discuss a few dimensions of this issue. One very important dimension is the history. History is very important because, as the Quran tells us, Allah tells us in the Quran, have you not gone and seen the plight of the people that came before you? Herein is a clear encouragement for us to study our history, our past, because we can't understand the present until we understand the history. And part of the problem of why the Israel-Palestine conflict has gone on for so long is because people don't give sufficient attention to the history. So one aspect I want to discuss is the history, the origins of this conflict. Another very important dimension that we need to discuss here is, why is this important to us as Muslims? What is the central issue here with Palestine as far as Islam is concerned? And I think that's a very important point to discuss. And finally tonight, I think it's important for us to discuss, what do we do from here? How is it that we as Muslims, as a Muslim community here in Australia, respond to this issue? So if we can cover these three issues tonight, alhamdulillah, that would be an achievement, I think. Would you be happy with that, Imam? Yeah? We go for that. So the first issue to discuss is the history or the origin of the conflict. I'll have you know that most people, Muslim and non-Muslim, don't understand anything about the history of this conflict. And it's ironic, actually, because if you think about how much we hear about it, it's a phenomenal amount. I mean, on the news every night for the past several decades, we've heard about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Almost every evening in the newspapers, repeatedly, for decades, we've been hearing about the Israel-Palestine conflict. But in reality, we don't hear anything about the origins of the conflict. We don't understand why this issue is continuing, and we don't understand fundamentally what is going on there. We hear about violence, we hear about deaths, we hear about funerals and this sort of thing. We hear about the peace process from time to time, but we don't actually hear about where this started. Studies have been done to look at the number of times that the word occupation is used when this conflict is mentioned in the media. Only 4% of articles ever mention the word occupation when they refer to this conflict. So how can any Australian person understand what's going on over there without understanding that there is an illegal military occupation going on? They can't understand. So we need to go right back to the origins and understand this conflict. Now, just this week, the most recent edition of Time magazine has focused on the Israel-Palestine conflict, this situation in Gaza at the moment. And one of the things the author of the main article wrote is that, this is an ancient conflict and we shouldn't expect any resolution anytime soon. This is absolute and complete nonsense. In fact, more so than that, this is just simply Zionist propaganda, that this is an ancient conflict between Jews and Arabs. This is not the truth at all. There has never been any ancient conflict between Muslims and Jewish people. There was some issues that arose during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. But this had to do with a treaty that was made with the people of Medina and the breach of that treaty by certain Jewish tribes. This is not an issue about all Jews for all time, nothing like that. And if we look through Islamic history, we can see that Jews fared the best when they lived in the Muslim world, when they lived in Palestine under Muslim rule, when they lived in Baghdad or Damascus or Istanbul or Cordova in Spain under Muslim rule. They fared the best. Where Jews have been mistreated in history is where they lived under European Christian rule. This is where they've had their hardest time, not under the Muslims. So there is no such thing as an ancient conflict between Muslims and Jews. This is not true. The origins of the Israel-Palestine conflict are modern. The origins of this conflict come in the World War I era, the post-World War I era. This is where the conflict starts, not before that. There is not some ancient hostility between the sons of Abraham, as they say it, the sons of Prophet Ibrahim, Ishmael and Ishaq, or Ismail and Isaac. This is completely false. The origins of this conflict lie in the post-World War I era. So I'll take you back to a couple of issues. Most of you are aware that most of the Arab-Muslim world was colonized by European powers. Some of these lands became colonized later on. They were part of the Ottoman Empire. Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire at the time of World War I. In the year 1918, this is when the British defeated the Ottoman Empire and took over the area of Palestine. And by the way, when we speak about the area of Palestine, we're talking about that piece of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. This is the area that we have historically referred to as Palestine. And in fact, for 2,000 years, this is what human beings have referred to as Palestine. This particular land was a part of the Ottoman Empire. The British defeated the Ottomans in 1918. But 1 year before that, they made an agreement with the World Zionist Organization. This is not conspiracy theory, this is historical fact. They made an agreement with them, it's called the Balfour Declaration. Arthur Balfour was the Foreign Secretary of the British government. He made an agreement with the World Zionist Organization that Britain would endeavour to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And there were a couple of other clauses to that declaration. The next year, the British defeat the Ottomans and they take control over Palestine. From that point onwards, they facilitated the massive immigration of Jews from Europe into Palestine. Hundreds of thousands of Jews came. Now, while Palestine was under Ottoman rule, it's important to look at the population of that place. We see that most of the people were Muslim. About 80+% were Muslim. About 10 or 15% were Christian, and about 2 or 3% were Jewish. This was the population of Palestine at the time the British defeated the Ottomans. When Britain took over, they started bringing hundreds of thousands of Jews from Europe, which definitely upset the demographic balance. And this is where the origins of the Israel-Palestine conflict lie. The British themselves conducted commissions because the hostilities started right from the 1920s. There was, there was fighting, there was riots and this type of thing. And so the British conducted various commissions, the Shaw Commission, the Hope Simpson Commission, the Haycraft Commission. This is all historically documented to find out why is this hostility between the Jews and the Arabs going on in Palestine. And there were two answers they got from every commission that they put forth. And that is that the Palestinians were being driven off their land by these new Jewish settlers, and they were excluded from being able to work on that land. They were excluded from labour. These were the two reasons that every commission put forth. The being taken from their land being taken from them, and then being driven from their land and not being able to work there. These were the two reasons. So the origins of the conflict are very clear. The influx of massive Jewish immigration, hundreds of thousands of Jews from Europe, this is the start of the conflict. This situation went on for about a decade, and between 1936 and 1939, the Palestinians put up a major revolt against British occupation. And this was something that was happening in various parts of the Muslim world, because Palestine wasn't the only country under European colonization. Most of the Muslim world was under European colonial rule, whether it be the British, the French, the Italians, or so on. And the Palestinians, like other Muslims, tried to resist the colonial occupation. Between 1936 and 1939, they put up their strongest resistance. And in fact, they regained control over many parts of Palestine. But the British brought in about 100,000 troops to suppress this so-called revolt. And the British were able to take back Palestine. And one of the things they did was almost completely disarm the Palestinians of any weapons that they had. And of course, the weapons they had were quite simple. I mean, it was, World War I, rifles, this type of very simple things. But even these were stripped of the Palestinians. And so they were a very defenseless people coming into the 1940s. It's in the 1940s that the Jews then, these hundreds of thousands that had come into Palestine, that now made up about 30% of the population, went from being 3% at the time of the Ottomans to now being about 30% of the population with their massive immigration from Europe. They now mounted their challenge against the British. And this is referred to in a very important book called The Gun and the Olive Branch. It's written by a British journalist. His name was David Hirst. He wrote this book back in 1977. And in that book, he describes what the Jews did as gun Zionism. He said this is the first terrorism that took place in the Middle East. He said it was the Jews who committed the first acts of terrorism in the Middle East. So there was bombings, there was sabotage against the British and against the Palestinians, bombs in marketplaces, the lynching of people, all the murder of people, all of this sort of thing was going on in Palestine. And the Jews were directing this against the British and against the Palestinian people. This culminated in the bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946. The King David Hotel in Jerusalem was the administrative capital, was the administrative centre, really, the headquarters for the British in Palestine. This hotel was bombed in 1946. Menachem Begin, who later became a Prime Minister of Israel, he was the leader of the terrorist organisation that did that act, that bombed the King David Hotel. So this took place in 1946. When this happened, the British said, finished. We want to wash our hands of Palestine. We can't take this anymore. The loss of life, the cost to the British government of trying to maintain control over Palestine in the face of all of this, what they described as terrorism at that time. And so in 1947, they handed the so-called problem of Palestine over to the United Nations. The United Nations was only just newly formed. The previous international organisation was called the League of Nations, and so the United Nations was come after that. So the United Nations decided, they had formed various committees to decide, well, how should we respond to this situation in Palestine, and they decided on a recommendation to partition Palestine. In fact, it required the United States to do a lot of underhanded lobbying and pressure and intimidation of a number of countries who were on the United Nations at that time to vote for that petition resolution, because the world overwhelmingly was opposed to the idea of petition. But the United States, and this is another historical fact, they intimidated many of the third world nations into accepting this petition resolution. So it was passed. It is known as General Assembly Resolution 181. General Assembly Resolution 181. And it recommended the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. Now this is very important, because if you even visit the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs website or read any of the Zionist Israeli propaganda, you'll see they make a lot of discussion about this Resolution 181. The United Nations divided Palestine and they gave the Palestinians the chance to have their state, and they rejected it, so on and so forth. But you have to understand the details of this Resolution 181 in order to understand why this is complete nonsense and propaganda. Okay, the first thing is that this resolution said Palestine will be divided into two states, Jewish and Arab. 55% will be given to the Jewish state, 45% will be given to the Palestinian state. So right from the get-go, this is not fair, right? Let's look at it in a bit more detail. In this Jewish state, this 55%, all of the key infrastructure, we're talking about the port, which is in Haifa. We're talking about the airport, which was there. We're talking about the electricity sources. We're talking about the water sources, Lake Tiberias, for example, which feeds the Jordan River. All of these key infrastructural points would lie within the Jewish state, within this 55%. And then the rest, the less significant areas, the most fertile land was to be in the Jewish state. The secondary land, the least fertile, the land with the least infrastructural development, the 45%, this was going to go to the Palestinian people. But it gets worse. Not only is the distribution unfair and the quality of land they're getting unfair, but when we look at the situation, we'll see that the Jews at the time were only 30% of the population. in spite of the fact that hundreds of thousands of them had been brought in from Europe, they were still only 30% of the population. The Palestinians were 70% of the population. In spite of all of this Jewish immigration, they were still 70% of the population. Another very crucial point here is that the Jews only legally owned 6.6% of the land. They only legally owned 6.6% of the land. In that 55% that was to become their state, they only legally owned 11% of that land. Yeah? Those Jewish people had only been there, over 97% of them had only been there for the last 30 years. Okay? And the Palestinians had been there for millennia. Their fathers, their grandfathers, they are the indigenous, you talk about the indigenous people, we talk about that in this country, they are the indigenous people of Palestine. They had been there for generations and generations and generations. So they're 70% of the population. They had been there for millennia, and they legally own 93% of that land. And they're getting 45%. So why would they accept Resolution 181? Why would any people on this planet accept that resolution? Of course they rejected it. And of course the whole Arab world, the whole Muslim world rejected this. And much of the third world rejected this as well, because everybody could see how unfair that was. But the Israelis, they didn't come unprepared. They're thinking people, they came with a plan. Years before this Resolution 181, they had sent people into the various Palestinian villages all around Palestine to document certain things. What capabilities does the village have? How many men are there? Do they have any weapons? What crops do they grow? What other things do they produce? What things do they make? What do they manufacture? In other words, how viable is that village? Right? What prospects does it have? And they documented this for the whole of Palestine. Now, this is not another conspiracy theory. This is well documented in a number of books written by Israeli historians. The most recent of which is written by an Israeli historian by the name of Ilan Pappy. Ilan Pappy wrote a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. It was released in 2007. Any information you want about this is documented in his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ilan Pappy. So the Israelis had built up this very detailed catalogue of all Palestinian villages. And so after Resolution 181 was passed and rejected by the Palestinian people and the Arab world, the Jewish militias, the military and the paramilitary immediately went into action. They had been well trained. They had served with British forces in World War I. They had served with British forces in World War II. They had very good training. They had very good weaponry. And they had a lot of money coming in from Europe and from the United States especially. So they were very well equipped, very well trained, and very well armed. And so they were ready to take on the Palestinian people, who were really just largely a peasant population, completely disarmed from what the British had did to them in the 1930s. And so they began from 1947, from November 1947, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Now, a lot of people talk about, this war of 1948. The war of 1948 that supposedly started in May 1947 after Israel declared its state. May 1947, Israel declared the state of Israel, and then they said all of the Arab countries attacked us. But what they neglect to tell you is that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine began in November 1947, 6 months before any state of Israel was declared. As soon as that resolution was passed and it was rejected, and you understand now why it was rejected, they immediately went into action. First of all, the Israelis secured the 55% that was to be in their state, and they got rid of almost 90% of any Palestinians who were living in that first 55% that they wanted for their state. They ethnically cleansed. There were about 11 major towns or cities completely emptied of their Palestinian inhabitants. Can you imagine, like the Gold Coast, for example, completely emptied of its indigenous people? This is what they did. 11 major towns and cities completely emptied of their inhabitants, either killed or driven out. And At least 35 massacres took place. And this is not from Palestinian historians. Israeli historians documented 35 massacres that took place during this period. So you had hundreds of thousands of Palestinians driven from their homes and land just in this first 6 months alone. They estimate about 250,000, 250,000 driven from their homes and land just in this first 6 months alone. And then the process continued. So this ethnic cleansing continued for 6 months. In the end, about 800,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes and land. And so many more were murdered, so many women were raped. This is well documented by the historians. But 800,000 driven from their homes and land. When we talk about the Palestinian refugees, right, the right of return of Palestinian refugees, we're talking about the descendants of these 800,000 people that were driven from their homes and land. I'll come back to this issue of right of return, but one thing we should remember is, can you tell me one other international conflict where refugees haven't been able to return to their home and land? Always it's the case. It's just the international standard. When you have war and then you have some resolution, the people get to return to their homes and land, except in this case, except in the case of Palestine. 800,000 driven from their homes and land and never to be returned. Now they number between 4 and 7 million people. We'll come back to that issue later. In May 1948, Israel declares the State of Israel. Okay, they declare their independence, they declare the State of Israel over 78% of historical Palestine. Now, if anyone who's been paying attention to what I've been saying knows that the UN only ever allocated 55%. How is it that they're declaring a state on 78% of historical Palestine? Basically, all of that territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, except the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. How do they declare a state over all of this area? How do they even come to possess anything more than that 55%? They did it through ethnic cleansing, and that's something the international community needs to answer for. Anyone who talks about, the right of Israel to exist and, recognition of Israel, in that is recognition of ethnic cleansing. So which Western government is prepared to do that? Because that's the reality. That is the only way they came to possess that extra 23%, not through the UN, through ethnic cleansing. So let's all keep that in mind. It's only after Israel declares its state that any Arab army enters Palestine. No Arab army entered before then. After this declaration, then you see the armies from Egypt, Syria, Jordan, also some from Lebanon, even some from Iraq come. But Israel is very well equipped, very powerful. In fact, numerically, they had more troops than any of these Arab countries combined. Well, more troops than what the Arab countries were committing. Better weapons than what the Arab countries were committing. The only significant challenge was that mounted by the Arab Legion, which is basically controlled by Jordan. This is the only army that mounted any significant challenge. And what they were able to do was maintain control of the West Bank. So after this so-called War of 1948, which ended about a year later, 1949, 1950, we see Israel in possession of 78% of historical Palestine. The Gaza Strip, the area known as the Gaza Strip, was under the control of Egypt, and the West Bank, including Jerusalem, including Al-Quds, was under the control of Jordan. And this is how the situation remained for the next, say, 20 years. Until 1967, Israel again goes to war with Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. In this war, it captures the Gaza Strip, and in fact the Sinai Peninsula as well, from Egypt. It captures the West Bank, including Jerusalem, from the Jordanians, and it captures the Golan Heights from Syria. So it comes into possession of all of this territory. So today when they refer to the occupied territories or the occupied Palestinian territories, they're referring to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank that were captured in 1967. And from this point on, the Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are faced with a Israeli military occupation. And that situation has continued all the way up until today. One more thing that we should understand about this conflict is that there are a number of layers that have been built on. Now, I mentioned about the original problem, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. 800,000 driven from their homes and lands, so many massacres and so on. The property that the Israelis came to possess. Because when they drove the Palestinians from their land, from their homes, they captured all of their fruit groves, their olive trees, their citrus trees. They took their houses and they went and lived in their houses, and they brought more Jews from Europe and different parts of the world and put them in those houses, Palestinian houses. They just took over complete villages. That's the ones that they didn't raze to the ground. And anyone who's... I should have given some background about myself. My PhD thesis is on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and I went there in 2006, and that's where I did my field research. And there are some places in Israel where they built these, beautiful, forests, because they're so environmentally friendly, so they build these wonderful forests. Those forests that they've built are built over Palestinian villages that have been razed to the ground, and all the people in those villages were massacred. That's where they built those parks and forests. Okay? So if you ever go there, look very closely at the ground, and in some places you'll actually see the foundations of people's homes, and they built forests over that to try and disguise the ethnic cleansing that took place. You can see it for yourself. Don't have to go far, go to Jerusalem and just go to the areas just around Jerusalem, and you can see it for yourself. Okay, now coming back to this issue. 1967, Israel takes control of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and they've continued a military occupation there, and I mentioned about multi-layers. Today, so it begins with the ethnic cleansing, and then you've got this military occupation that's been going on for now over 40 years. But you can add to that, within the West Bank, there's 500 plus checkpoints. Palestinians cannot go from one town to another without going through numerous Israeli checkpoints. Just to give you an example, the trip from here to Brisbane is about 40 minutes, right? Well, I live in Underwood, which is near Logan, about 40 minutes, nothing more than that. That's like going from Ramallah in the West Bank to Nablus, which is in basically the centre of the West Bank. And you can, if you're lucky, you can go from Ramallah to Nablus in about an hour. And I've made that journey. To leave there, you line up for at least 2 hours. This is on a good day. Usually people have to bring an overnight bag because they close the checkpoint, you have to sleep there. But 2 hours, you line up, men, women and children, babies crying, hungry, suffering, people needing to go to work, people needing to go to school, so on and so forth. The Israeli military at these checkpoints, they don't care. They point guns on people, harass people, treat people like animals. You line up for 2 hours and eventually you get through that checkpoint to get out of Nablus. Then you have to hop into a little taxi or little small bus. And then you drive for how long? 5 minutes. Another checkpoint. Everybody out. Check the whole car. One guy with me had fruit. He was a fruiter. And so he had boxes of fruit that he wanted to send, to the next town. Every box has to be checked because there might be something in there, whatever, all of this nonsense. So that journey, basically going from here to Logan, right? 40 minutes, 5 hours. How can any society function like that? I met people, and for us Muslims, family is very important. You visit your parents and your relatives constantly. I met people in places like Ramallah who had never seen their mother, their own mother, for more than 6 months, and she only lives 40 minutes away. Never seen their mother for 6 months because the journey is too hazardous because of these checkpoints. People can't get to school. People can't get to their jobs. How can an economy function? How can goods be delivered when you've got this sort of situation, these blockades? Even the World Bank has acknowledged that the biggest problem facing the Palestinian economy is Israel, and specifically these Israeli checkpoints. So this is another layer. Then you've got the closures and curfews. Whole towns are just simply closed. That's it. No one goes in, no one goes out. No one goes out of their houses. No one goes into the streets. The Israeli military patrol the streets. You can't do anything. You have to stay home. And this could last for a couple of hours or a few days or a few weeks. Just depends. This is another layer on the whole thing. Then you've got the wall. This wall that's going around the West Bank. This is not on the so-called Green Line, the armistice line of 1949, or whatever, the 67 line, whatever you want to call it. The length of the wall is double the length of the border. How is that? How can the length of the wall be double the length of the border? It's because it cuts deep into the West Bank. And because you've got all these Israeli settlements, you've got hundreds of Israeli settlements, you've got almost 500,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank, supposedly Palestinian land. And this wall cuts inside to annex those settlements, to make them part of Israel, to include them as part of Israel. So the wall is twice as long as the border itself. Okay, and anyone who can say that this is for security and not for a land grab is speaking complete nonsense. And people are then cut off from their villages. People who are farmers have now a wall between their house and their land that they're meant to be tending, between their houses and their fruit groves or their citrus trees or whatever, olive grove. They can't even reach their land to water it because of this wall. So this is another layer. So what I put to you is that if the wall came down tomorrow, well, that would be wonderful. That would be a good thing. But it wouldn't change anything. The fundamental problem would still be there. If all the checkpoints disappeared tomorrow, it would be wonderful, it would be great. Palestinians would be able to breathe a little bit, but it wouldn't change the problem. If Israel was to withdraw from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, that would be wonderful. The end of the military occupation, that would be great. But that wouldn't solve the problem either. The problem is so deep, and it comes back to the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people way back from 1947. Human beings must have their rights. Human rights. Human rights are based on the fact that human beings are human beings. You have those rights because you are a human being. And this is what is being denied to the Palestinian people. So the fundamental issues are the right of return of the Palestinian people to their homes and land, the end of these Israeli settlements on Palestinian land, and the end of this occupation and every other layer that has come after it, the return of Jerusalem. One of the things I did for my PhD thesis was I analysed every single United Nations Security Council resolution that has ever been passed over the last 40 years on Palestine. Sorry, over the last 60 years. And no single Security Council resolution ever recognises Israel's right to Jerusalem. Never. There is not one single resolution that ever talks about Israel having a legitimate right to Jerusalem, to Al-Quds. Every resolution regards Israel's presence in Jerusalem as an illegal occupation. It has no rights to Jerusalem whatsoever. And that's one thing that everybody needs to keep in mind. Israel is fooling the world by calling its unofficial capital, supposed to be in Tel Aviv, but they say their capital is Jerusalem. Right? Israel has no legal right to Jerusalem whatsoever. That's according to the United Nations Security Council resolutions. So Jerusalem, the settlements, the right of return of the refugees, the occupation, all of these are the central issues of the conflict that need to be addressed and understood by people. And the solution a just solution to all of these lies right there in the UN Security Council resolutions. They have made decisions on all of these things. They have said that the Palestinian refugees have the right to return to their homes and land, that the Israeli settlements on Palestinian land are completely illegal, that Jerusalem is illegally occupied by Israel, and Israel has no right to change the demographic, the cultural, or any of the physical characteristics of Jerusalem, which is what they've continued to do. It's all there in the Security Council resolutions, but we'll come back to this issue of how we respond later on. I'll talk a bit more about these Security Council resolutions then. So this is just to give you a little bit of historical background of this Israel-Palestine conflict as it's known. And we can get in more detail during a question and answer session, inshallah. Okay. Now another question is, as Muslims, why is this an issue for us? A lot of people ask this, and unfortunately you hear some Muslims say, oh, it's just about land, it's, we shouldn't be too worried about it, it's, not an Islamic issue. It is an Islamic issue. It is an Islamic issue, make no mistake about that. And some people who say, yeah, it's an Islamic issue, they give misguided reasons as to why it's Islamic. They say, well, our first Qibla was towards Jerusalem. That's true. Prophet ﷺ instructed us to face towards Jerusalem, and for 7 months, even after the Hijrah, this is the direction that we faced until we were instructed to face towards the Kaaba. So the first Qibla, yeah, that's true. And the Isra and Mi'raj, the Prophet ﷺ was taken from Makkah to the furthest mosque in Jerusalem, Masjid al-Aqsa, and then from there he ascended up to heaven, to Jannah, to meet with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you can go to the place from which he made his ascension. Over that place is the Sakra, or the Dome of the Rock. And anyone who's been there has seen the earth raised out of the ground and a huge space underneath, and you can go and pray there. You can go and pray underneath that rock that has been raised out of the earth. Some people are nodding their head, they've been there, they've seen it, right? This is the place from which the Prophet ﷺ made his mi'raj up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to meet with him. So for these reasons it's very significant. There are a number, we recognize all of the prophets, the previous prophets. Some hadith say 124,000 prophets. We recognize these prophets. Many of these prophets were born and died in that land of Palestine. You can go there and their graves are there. Many of our Sahaba went to Palestine and their graves are there. There's many holy places, of course, not the least of which is Masjid al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock. The oldest standing monument in the Muslim world is the Dome of the Rock. And then the next one is Masjid al-Aqsa. These were built by an Umayyad Caliph, Abdul Malik bin Marwan, at the end of the 7th century. And these are the oldest standing monuments in the Muslim world today, still standing. So there's a lot of reasons why this is and a lot of our great scholars have come from the land of Palestine. Imam Shafi is from Gaza. In fact, he's from Gaza. This is where he was born. So we have a deep connection, we have a deep history to this land. But Islam is not a religion of sentimentalities and symbols. It's not a religion of sentimentalities and symbols. There's a much deeper and more important reason why Palestine is an Islamic issue. And that is that Islam is a religion of justice. First and foremost, Islam is a religion of justice. Just think about the central messages of Islam. They are about the prohibition of exploiting people. Why is riba haram? We talk a lot about the prohibition of riba. Why is it haram? Because it involves the exploitation of people. The exploitation particularly of poor people, to the point where people were in debt bondage, the doubling and redoubling of what they owed to wealthy people, put them in a state of debt bondage. This is oppression, and this is not tolerated in Islam. Look at the verses in the Quran on jihad. Look at the context in which they are written. All of these verses are not about, oh, you're fighting against people because they don't believe the same thing that you believe. No. Allah says quite clearly in the Quran, if He wanted people to believe the same way, He would have made it like that. He's given no compulsion in religion. The Quran is very clear about this. Unto me my way and lakum dinakum waliyadin. Unto me my way and unto you yours. The Quran is very clear that people are free to make a decision for themselves. This is why the Quran presents very strong arguments about the existence of Allah and the importance of worshipping Allah, because He wants human beings. This is why the aql has been given to the human being, so they make up their own mind. Because you can't judge someone, you can't hold someone accountable until they made a free choice. This is why there is no compulsion in Islam. You make your free choice and then you'll be held accountable for what you do. So Islam is a religion that supports the justice of people, that supports fairness. The verses of the Quran that speak about jihad speak about overcoming the oppression, standing up for the weakest people in society. They speak about people who have, how many times do the verses on jihad and qital speak about standing up for those who have been driven from their homes and land? The permission to fight is given to those who have been driven from their homes and land. So some people are a bit dismissive. They say, oh, it's just a matter of land. Land is a very important issue in Islam. In the Quran particularly, land is very important. One of the best rewards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can give people is to give them a presence, a permission to live in a certain land. This was something that the children of Israel were given. Permission to live in such a holy land, should they abide by the laws and the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So to be given land is a very important thing, and to have land taken from you is a very horrible thing. So much so that Allah gives you permission to fight against people who do that to you, because that is oppression. What does Allah say about oppression? Some people are a bit dismissive. They think that, oh, you know, what's happening over there, it's punishment from God and this sort of nonsense. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very clear in Hadith Qudsi, for example. He speaks about the prohibition of oppressing. He says He prohibits oppression on Himself, and so He prohibits human beings to do it to one another, so don't oppress. Very clear in Hadith Qudsi. So this is what we're seeing in Palestine today is oppression. Allah does not permit or allow oppression. He does not do it Himself, and He doesn't allow other human beings to do it. Islam is a religion of justice. It's a religion of human rights. It's one of the first religions in the world, really, to come out very strongly and set out basic human rights for people. And we did it in all realms. Even in the way war is conducted. Unfortunately, sometimes war has to be conducted. This is what the Quran says, for self-defense, to overcome oppression, to reclaim what has been taken from you. For example, driven from your homes and land, drive them out from where they drove you out. So you take back what's rightfully yours. But we have to understand that this permission is given for the purposes of upholding justice, upholding the rights of people, because that is fundamental. And so this is what the religion of Islam is about. It is a religion of justice, it's a religion of fairness, it's a religion of rights for people. And this is the main reason why Palestine is an Islamic cause. It is because it is about justice, it is about human rights. And these are two things that all Muslims should be concerned about. So the fact that Masjid al-Aqsa and Dome of the Rock are there, this is the place from which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ went for Mi'raj. Many of our Sahaba are buried there. These are very important things. But at the end of the day, the Islamic reason why we support this is not because of sentimentalities or symbols. It's because of human rights. It's because of justice. That's the reason. The third thing that I want to talk about tonight is what do we do as a community? How do we respond to this? It's very important that Muslims are also expected to be law-abiding people. We cannot be vigilantes and take the law into our own hands. It's not permitted in our religion. We must use the halal means that we've been given. Now we live here in a democratic society that allows us to have free speech. That in fact we are encouraged to put our concerns forward to our elected representatives. But unfortunately, I don't think enough Muslims are utilising this option, this means. We need to be very clear with our elected representatives that we are concerned about the human rights and the injustice and the oppression being suffered by the men, the women and children in Palestine and other parts of the world. But I'm concentrating on Palestine tonight, that's the topic of discussion. We are concerned about that. We need to, collectively, our numbers are significant in this country, much larger than the Jewish population in this country, much, much larger. The Jewish population is insignificant compared to our numbers. What's wrong with us? And we tend to live, increasingly so, in certain suburbs together where our numbers become even more influential. But how many Muslims have taken the time to write a letter to their local member or to go to the office of their local member and say, hey, this is a democratic country. You speak about human rights. You want to be on the UN Security Council. Look at what's happening over there to the Palestinian people. 60 years of occupation. Hundreds of resolutions being passed. What are you doing about it? I expect you, as my elected representative, to take this up to Kevin Rudd. He's spoken about indigenous people, indigenous rights. Palestinians are the indigenous people of that land. He's spoken about universal human dignity. Where is the dignity for the Palestinian people? So I expect you, as my local representative, to take this matter forward because I'm concerned about it. And at the next election, I'm going to be asking you what you did about this issue. These politicians care about nothing else except their re-election prospects. You make this an election issue for them, they will respond. This is how they operate. I mean, they could care less about this issue or that issue, but if it affects their election prospects, they will care. They will care. So collectively, Muslims need to make their case very clear to their elected representatives. Write to them, go and see them. Write to the media as well. I mean, let other Australians know that this is an important issue. One thing we need to do that's very important is to not couch this as a Muslim issue, or certainly not a Palestinian issue. It's not just a Palestinian issue. It's not just an Arab issue. It's not just a Muslim issue. We have to make this an Australian issue. Do you know that 68% of Australians hold negative views towards Israel because of their policies and practices that they employ in the region and specifically against the Palestinian people? 68% of Australians hold negative views. And this is repeated all around the Europe as well. Do you know 70% of Americans don't actually support their government's policy on the Israel-Palestine conflict? They want their government to be even-handed on this issue. There is a huge amount of global support for a just resolution of this conflict. And that message needs to go to the media and it needs to go to politicians as well. The people are out there. The Australian people are out there. We've had a number of rallies for this cause, in Brisbane. Just last week we had one. We had over 2,000 people. Most of them were Australians who came to this rally. For people to spend their Saturday afternoon to come out to the city and march through the streets, especially with us, Muslims, is remarkable. It means they really are concerned. And if 2,000 people came and spent their time and effort to come out there, you can imagine how many more are concerned about this issue. I have spoken about this Palestine issue at so many different conferences and functions and churches. Churches invite me to come and tell them about Palestine. And the response I get is overwhelming. I will always get one person in the crowd. They're a bit pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist, whatever, and they'll ask some, questions that because they've got some idea from, some Jewish or Zionist propaganda. They're easy to dismiss once you have your basic facts in place. But overwhelmingly, 99% of people I speak to are completely supportive of the Palestinian cause. Why do they support it? Because they know it's an issue about justice and human rights. It's an issue about the upholding of international law. And that's the level at which we need to speak to people. When we speak to our politicians about it, we need to say, look, we're not interested in you being pro-
My education, food, enough money to get by.
I think the main responsibility for this doesn't lie with us here in Australia. We're individual citizens, we have limited resources available to us. There's a limit to what we can do here. But those countries that are right there in the region, they bear a big responsibility for this ongoing conflict. It's politics why they don't do more. Unfortunately, there's a lot of unfortunately, Muslims and many Muslim countries, particularly some Arab countries, are not sufficiently independent to be able to do what they want to do. They're heavily reliant on certain countries for aid or for some other resources and things like that. And this inhibits their ability to do what they should be doing on this conflict. Now, in saying that, if you look at the United Nations Security Council resolutions and other General Assembly resolutions, you can see that it's Muslim countries that have consistently kept this issue on the agenda. And that's about all we can say that they have done. They have kept it alive on the agenda of the United Nations at the General Assembly and the Security Council. But in practical terms, they could have done a lot more to support a resolution of this conflict than what they've done. It's pathetic, really. It's sad, it's pathetic. And they're answerable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for their inactions. Yeah.
Is it true that the Egyptian president guy is ordered the armies to fire on Palestinian people fleeing across to Egyptian land?
I have heard reports about that at various times during this. It's extremely unfortunate that the people of Gaza have been under this military blockade. One thing that we should be very clear about is that in 2005, Israel withdrew its settlers and its military from the Gaza Strip. This does not mean that the Gaza Strip is now free and independent. It is still occupied territory. It's been converted from a place that has settlers and military inside to basically a big open-air prison where all of the guards are outside. That's the reality of it. The Palestinians don't have control over their land, they don't have control over their borders, they don't have control over their sea or their airspace. Israel constantly is violating the airspace over the Gaza Strip and the West Bank as well, and southern Lebanon, all of these places. It's prevented Palestinians from fishing. There's no natural resources in the Gaza Strip, and one of the available sources of protein is fish, because the Mediterranean Sea is right there. But the Palestinians can't fish in the Mediterranean Sea. You'll notice that Israel constantly cuts off the supply of electricity. And electricity is important for a number of things. One of those is the treatment of sewage. When you have no electricity, you end up pumping raw sewage into the Mediterranean. And if you're only allowed a couple of nautical miles for fishing, all of that water in which you can fish is polluted. So you're not going to catch any fish there. And the areas that aren't polluted, the Israelis patrol, and they will shoot any Palestinian fishing boat that attempts to catch fish in those waters there. So the Gaza Strip is still completely occupied. The only outlet, the only border they have is with Egypt. But unfortunately, the Egyptian government has been so weak, and they have not supported their fellow Muslims, you know, brothers, sisters, and children, allowing them to have, you know, an outlet and a place through which, you know, food and supplies and things that every society needs can come through. So it's very sad. It's disgusting. It's shameful, really. The lack of courage that any Arab nation has had to support this issue. And you're right, there have been reports like this, unfortunately. Yeah.
Someone told me that it's been taken by blood, you can only get it back by blood.
Sorry?
It's been taken by blood, you can only get it back by blood.
I mean, the history of Palestine says that it's the people inside never achieve. I mean, the history of Palestine is that it's been inhabited by many different people over time, and it's been ruled by many different people. The people who have ruled the second longest are the Egyptians, 1,150 years. The people who have ruled the longest are the Muslims. Over 1,200 years of Muslim rule, only interrupted between 1099 and 1187 by the Crusades, taken back by Salahuddin al-Ayyubi from outside. Then again, the Crusaders ruled from 1224 until 1244. But apart from these periods, 1,200 years of continuous Muslim rule. So if anyone is to make the argument about ancient title, who's ruled there the longest? Definitely it's the Muslims. The Arab and Turkish Muslims combined, 1,200 years. They talk about the Kingdom of David and Solomon. Kingdom of David and Solomon, read your history books, 73 years. 927 until 1000 BC, that's it. So if the Israelis want to go down the line of ancient title, they haven't got a chance against the Muslims. The Muslims have consistently ruled Palestine for 1,200 years. But what you're saying is correct. History shows us it's only ever been liberated from outside. Yeah. Yes, there's another masjid underneath Masjid al-Aqsa. It's another part of Masjid al-Aqsa. You can go underneath there and see it. There are cracks in the ceiling, and this is because if you go in the front of Masjid al-Aqsa, there's a large drop-off, and there's massive amount of excavations that the Israelis are doing in front of Masjid al-Aqsa on the other side. It's outside of the walls of the Haram, you could say. They're doing all of this excavation under there, which is weakening the foundations of Masjid al-Aqsa. You can see the cracks for yourself. I've seen them. Yes. Sorry? Well, I suppose that the argument would be that, oh well, whoops, sorry about that. It just collapsed. We didn't destroy it. It just collapsed. There's a very strong movement in Israel from the right wing. The right wing, very ultra-Orthodox people, Jewish people, they are outnumbering in terms of birth rate, 7-1, the secular people. And they make a very strong drive for the destruction of Masjid al-Aqsa and the destruction of the Dome of the Rock to build what they call the third temple. First one was destroyed by the Babylonians and then the Romans, and they want to build the third one now on the site where the two mosques are standing today. So this is an important issue as well. Yeah.
Why should we resort to international law or UN resolutions when international law recognizes Israel's right to exist?
Does it?
Because they accept the division of the land that Israel comes out, but we don't accept it.
International law recognises the state of Israel, that's correct. I mean, if we talk about the United Nations, the General Assembly and then the Security Council, but there's some clauses in there that we could have a further discussion about. But one of the things international law talks about very clearly is the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force. Okay, I'll explain that. Basically what that means is if you conquer territory, you capture territory through the use of armed force, that acquisition or your control over that territory is inadmissible. It's illegal. That is a very important clause when we look at the Israel-Palestine issue. Because while they may be able to argue that 55% of their land was allocated by the United Nations, although General Assembly resolutions don't have the authority that a Security Council resolution have, and this one is only a General Assembly resolution. They may have a claim to 55%. They don't have a claim to 78% because that extra 23% was taken through the use of armed force, which is inadmissible according to international law. The reality is that many of these things are now a foregone conclusion. All right? So the reason why we need to look to international law is to start to get back some measure of justice. It has to be step by step. The first thing is you can use international law to say that all the settlements are illegal and must be dismantled. That's black and white. That Jerusalem is not the property of Israel. It is illegally occupied by Israel. That the territory Israel captured through the use of force is inadmissible. All of these things I think, is a constructive way to approach the conflict. We've already made it very clear that there isn't going to be any Arab army that is going to bring about this through, external force or anything like that. International law is a very constructive way of approaching this conflict because Western powers have to listen to international law. Even when countries violate international law, they try and justify what they do on the basis of law. This is how important international law is to them. So I think it provides a very constructive way of approaching this issue. Yeah.
Do you really think that one day Palestinians will get the land back by these resolutions?
Well, did anybody ever think that there would be a black president of the United States? If you were living in the 1960s, you would have said, no way, that will never happen. Did anyone ever think that South Africa would see majority rule, that the black people would have their rights back in that country? You were living in South Africa, prior to the 1990s, you would have said, no way, this is never going to happen. This regime is too powerful, too embedded, too supported by the West, it can't happen. I'll tell you why it did happen though. It didn't happen because of any military or economic or any other strategic power. It happened because of norms and identity factors. And the same thing could happen in the situation of Palestine if we approach the conflict in the right way. But I'll talk about South Africa just briefly. The Imam's from South Africa, so knows what I'm talking about. No military came in and gave the black people their rights and removed the national party in South Africa. That didn't happen. What happened was you had human beings all around the world that spoke about one concept, and that was racial equality. That's all they talked about. They talked about it for decades. From the 1960s, you had the first resolutions passed, and in fact, India was the country that put that on the table at the United Nations because they were concerned about the plight of the Indian people in South Africa. And so they put it on the table. Eventually, you had the United Nations pass resolutions talking about sanctions, this and that. But nothing fundamentally changed because two countries held out, the United States and Britain. What made the United States and Britain go along with the rest of the world and put sanctions on South Africa that eventually led to the collapse of the National Party in South Africa and the end of apartheid? What was it? It was norms, international norms and identity factors. No country, no political leader, domestically or internationally, could tolerate the image of being called a racist. It was intolerable, domestically and internationally. You could not stand for that. The anti-apartheid activists around the world engineered their campaign very strategically. They made it all about race. If you supported the white regime in South Africa, you were a racist. There was no other reason that was acceptable. They dismissed every argument that we're concerned about, because remember the Cold War was going on at this time, and the National Party in South Africa was like a bulwark against the spread of socialism or communism in Africa. Right? This is how it was pitched. All right? It was an important economic partner for the United States and for Britain, right, at this time. So in spite of strategic and military and economic interests, the United States and Britain had no choice but to go along with the rest of the world because they couldn't risk their image, their identity internationally. They had to support these basic human rights, the idea of racial equality. They couldn't be seen as racist in their own country, or no politician could tolerate that. And so the task for us is what international norm and what identity factor is the right button to push when it comes to the question of Palestine. If you find that, then you will set in motion things that will eventually lead to the restoration of rights and a just peace. But it's a matter of finding it. So I tell you that there are numerous cases in history where people would say, never, that is impossible, we cannot envision that happening. And it happens. But
Because unless the Arab countries stand up, Arab governments change their attitudes, nothing is going to happen.
okay, so then the task, if that's the way you see it, then the task is, how do you convince them that something is more important than the crumbs they're getting from in Western aid or whatever the case may be?
That's more important to them.
Right. So this is how we have to start thinking in this way. Yeah.
Unless they give up this, shun of this, the Western aid
Yeah.
and the Western Arab.
But what I will say, what I will say is that international norms and identity, how people are seen by others, they're important issues.
Black and white. This is against Muslims. The whole world is hostile.
Okay. So you take the point then. Then you're in agreement with me that it's your identity that matters. And this is something that we need to work
That's
on.
the main issue that we have to bring.
Yeah.
We are Muslims, we will not be Muslims.
I agree with you completely. Yes.
Excuse me, I heard about there is organization that is like for all imams around Israel. I don't know if they have something to do with that. All imams around Israel, like some strong paper, like use many like lawyers, Muslim lawyers, help them to write that. And there's a lot of communities around Israel. Why they need to choose a few of them, like that's to government, like any state or meet ruled by
Yes.
themselves. They are Australian citizens. They have rights.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Is there anything?
Definitely. Yeah, we're in just today, I mean, there is the National Imams Council.
We have given many letters to various old council, even to Kevin Rudd.
Right.
We have prepared an article
Yep.
in our stance. We have given a statement. The Australian National Imams Council, that's N, which is imams from all over the country.
Yep. I'll just repeat that in case someone didn't hear the Imam. The Imam of this masjid is part of the National Imams Council, and they have, they're his vice president. They've been doing their utmost to get this message across. But all of the Muslim organisations are also in the process right now of drafting another letter to Kevin Rudd to be copied to the Foreign Minister and one of the local ministers in Brisbane. Again, the next step also is to get all of the other non-Muslim organisations that we're friends with to write a letter. And do you know that it was only about less than 12 months ago that all of the churches got together, they sent a delegation to Palestine to see what was going on there, and when they came back, they wrote a letter to Kevin Rudd, and they gave him a number of they expressed their position to him that they want a resolution of this conflict on the basis of human rights and international law. They're calling on him to change his policy and so on. This is the churches, all of the churches together in Australia, calling on Kevin Rudd to change his policy on Palestine and to support a position based on human rights and international law. They are deeply concerned about the plight of the Palestinian people because remember, about 10% of the Palestinian people are Christian. Christians today cannot go and celebrate Christmas or Easter, whatever, in Jerusalem. They can't go to Bethlehem, they can't go to Nazareth and all of these other holy places to them. So this is something that Christian people need to be made more aware of. Your holiest places on earth you can't access because of an Israeli occupation. So the churches understand this and they have conveyed that to Kevin Rudd. But what we need to do is we need to work more closely with them and write jointly and visit these politicians jointly, and this is how the pressure can be applied. Yeah.
The media is run by the Jews, and American government that press the Jews. What are they going against it?
It's interesting to note this. The media is weak on this issue, not because of the ownership issues. It's because of a bit of a lack of understanding of journalists. And we have to understand how the media works. I mean, they want to put the least amount of effort into getting the news out to people. And they're not really concerned about the quality of that news. And so what they do is they rely a lot on PR, public relations. The Israelis have a very effective PR machine. We need, not only for the Palestine cause, but as a Muslim community, we need more effective PR machine so that when issues arise, we have the statement ready to go for the journalists. We need to build up a stronger relationship with journalists. The reason why the journalists tend to have, internationally, tend to have a more pro-Israeli line is for a couple of reasons. One, most journalists are based in Jerusalem and the Israelis control everything that goes on there. But the other reason is that they build up very strong relationships with journalists. And this is something that we have neglected to do. It's our responsibility to get to know the editor of the local newspaper. In Brisbane, we've formed a very good relationship now with the Courier Mail, with the editor of the Courier Mail, and you'll see that the Courier Mail won't write these hostile articles against Muslims that you'll find in other papers today, because of that relationship building process that's going on. It's improving. The more interaction you have, the more understanding there will be, and the less likely there will be this reactionary sort of, stereotypical, xenophobic type of articles that we've seen in the past. So it's a matter of making that relationship and letting people get to know us. When they get to know you, they'll understand you, and we can look for some more progress from there. Which one?
Why are Muslims so quick to condemn, something that is Israeli oppression and American oppression, when we have Muslim leaders who oppress Muslims, and we stand silent?
No, that's true. I mean, we have oppression not just being committed by non-Muslims. Muslims themselves are committing these acts of oppression. You're absolutely right. And all acts of oppression should be equally condemned. I agree with you. Yeah.
The Israeli media, and in fact the government here, is portraying Hamas to be a terrorist organization. What's our stance as Muslims? How do we regard Hamas?
Yeah. This is a very good question. One thing important to note is that the Australian government does not regard Hamas, the entire organisation, as a terrorist organisation. It only regards the Izz-ad-Din Qasim Brigade, which is the military wing of Hamas, as a terrorist organisation. Unlike the United States and Europe, where it's the whole of Hamas that's basically classified as terrorists. So there's a bit of a distinction here in Australia. Now, one thing we should note is that Islamic law, and the Imam can correct me if I'm wrong here, doesn't permit us to kill civilians. Okay? That's correct, isn't it, Imam? So when anyone, Muslim or otherwise, engages in the killing of civilians, we can't accept this. We can't condone this type of activity. Okay? Military against military, nobody disputes that. But civilians, we can't tolerate that. The problem we have is with, and people condemn suicide bombing. Okay, you condemn suicide bombing. But what we need to make people understand is that we condemn suicide bombing and the world condemns it, because this is an indiscriminate weapon. You walk into a marketplace or somewhere and you explode, and you have no calculation of who's going to be killed. You're not just going to hit a military target. Civilians are going to be killed as well, and this is not acceptable in our religion. The fundamental point here is the indiscriminate nature of the weapon. So just as the suicide bombing is condemned and should be condemned because of its indiscriminate nature, it will kill a civilian just as it'll kill a military target, so too are these bombs and these missiles that Israel and the United States and so on fire at civilian people. If you look at the death toll now, it's well over 1,000 people. The majority of those are civilians. Over 1/3 are children. Over 1/3 are children that have been killed in the Gaza Strip. So it's okay for people to condemn suicide bombing, fine. But they have to also condemn the dropping of bombs and the firing of missiles the way Israel does it, because they are targeting civilians as well. And this is an indiscriminate weapon, and for the same reason that suicide bombing is condemnable, this bombs and missiles that they use should also be condemned. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.